After all this, you still...
I still want that ghastly yes, and you had better deliver.
This is Greenhouse Gaslighting, a free and independent podcast discussing society and culture with a left-wing, down-to-earth perspective. If you've ever wanted a deep dive on the issues, but felt like the bar for entry was too high, then you're in the right place. You know, I don't feel too bad about the hiatus, because this is probably the second or third year in a row where we just forgot to do something for February. It happens.
February, it's the shortest month of the year. It's the month least worth covering.
Oh my God! How have you been coping with things recently? What's been up? How do you do it?
It's fast. Well, I like how you just came to the immediate conclusion that oh yeah, he's well adjusted. He's actually working. I mean, I guess it's fair. It's weird. So I'm. This isn't a secret, right? That I teach political science for a living and whatnot. So I engrossed in this stuff constantly. And I think I told my students at the start of the semester that because I had a what was it? It was sort of a mini conference. It was with the dean's office at the day, the Friday before the election, right? And my research, for those who may not be familiar, in part covers a lot of Trump's Twitter usage and whatnot. Have to catch up some stuff from the new term, but one of the questions I got was, so how do you sleep at night, basically? How do you what kind of rituals do you do to relax and whatnot? And I can't remember the exact answer that I made up, but I was kind of telling, my students, I was it's kind of therapeutic to the extent that I would consider it as such to have an outlet to talk about it with, right? Having people a captive audience of students to talk about it with, having presumably a captive audience of listeners at home on this show. That to me helps. Really, I mean, maybe deep down, maybe I'm just, I'm built different. Maybe I'm mentally sick in the head, right? I don't know. But for me, I somehow stay above water in some ways that this administration is failing to do. But that's a different story.
Yeah, I do want to take a sec to maybe apologize a little formally for the hiatus. So I want to stress to the listeners that I didn't intend for this to happen. In some ways, I am a victim of the new Trump term, although not directly. So we did our most recent episode this year.
We're all victims, at least indirectly. But
low key.
But yours in a way that's more, you have enhanced victimhood.
Oh my God, it's crazy how this happened, and it's and I'm not saying this to minimize the horrors of what they're doing to strip down the U.S. regulatory state. How many people have? I mean, this is you can't even. I like how they don't have the shame to call it a furlough. They are just hacking and slashing. So many people have lost their jobs. You might call them corrupt bureaucrats. They might be essential functionaries of the regulatory state. I'll let you determine that as you will. But basically right after we did the most recent episode, which was the day of the inauguration, I go into work the next day and they're like, buddy, you're getting laid off. So I'm ticking 2 boxes, unemployed and podcaster. Don't worry, nothing has changed. But it's part of a very worrisome trend on top of everything right now, where in addition to stripping down essential functions of the U.S. government, there has been a downward decline in employee retention in both the private and public sector now. You even see that in the nonprofit sector. So I just wanted to start today's program very openly with the assertion that if it wasn't a recession before, it is one now. I don't care what they call it.
Yeah, what I was gonna say too, and I was really it was really clicking with me as I was thinking about what you were saying a bit more, which was that I think, and some of it is it's our show, the way we try to do it is a victim of this too, where like
Yeah.
you've always mentioned that we try not to read the tea leaves too much, right? We try to be more certain. And really, I think the name, like if you could come up with a single term that just encompasses everything that has happened since Trump was inaugurated, is just uncertainty, right?
Yep.
We like it's like half of the things he has implemented or tried to implement it, some of it get frozen by the court, then it gets unfrozen, then refrozen again. The tariffs is like this ongoing joke of like we've had like 3 or 4 like today is the day that 100% tariffs will be instituted, and then they're not because like, oh hey, he realized that this would cause an economic impact, but he's still really committed to the idea of them, so he's still going to do them. And like I think that's leading into just a situation where you're going to end up with like, hey, like we know these tariffs are going to be inflationary. And one of the things too is you've also kind of opened up the door for like, well, companies can just be like, all right, well, screw it, we'll just raise prices anyways. Consumers will be none the wiser if the tariffs are in place or not, because who can know at any given moment, right? When it comes to like the furloughing or firing of employees, right? Like some of that's illegal, some of it's not. Some of it is, they try to do these buyouts. I don't think they were well received. I don't think a lot of employees have taken them. But like that's like all like part of this, right? Is that there's just so many aspects of this that are constantly uncertain and unclear, even for the most politically enfranchised among us, let alone the layman.
That's 100% spot on, and I think that's why we'd been kind of struggling to figure out like, okay, if we do come back on the air, like how do we address this? And I think a lot of people, I don't think it's reductive to try and use the first Trump term to understand the context of everything that's going on right now. It's kind of the only benchmark you have, right? But I think in both cases, the minute-to-minute news cycle is actually the name of the game. So the so-called ban and blitz, or his, as he calls it, the flood the zone strategy, seems to be working. For who? I still don't know. And in Bannon's own words, God, I don't like his choice of words here, even if he is like hinting at a grain of truth, is that the media is so lazy they can only focus on one thing at a time. I don't think that's just the media. I think that's everybody. That's kind of just how attention seems to work.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's fair. It's kind of, it's a people thing, right? And I think, the flood the zone strategy, it's interesting because it's so different from last time in a lot of ways, right? Like I was talking about this with some students in class where like, during the first Trump administration, the media cycle and maybe just general attention, as you said, got consumed by a lot of just nonsense, right? We spent a whole cycle on Covfefe and what that meant, right? Or the fact that the president was an idiot for making that typo in the first place. Person, woman, man, camera, TV took up a cycle. Like, what's the most like petty and dumb thing that has taken up like any attention span during this administration? Like, personally, I can't think of much because most of it is like stuff that's like actually serious, but we just like don't really have the time to like fully digest it before he just does something else that's completely crazy and insane.
Yeah, and it's like I don't even think we're going to be able to address all of it in today's episode. As is the nature of the strategy. Like, if you do look at like, let's say February 2019 to February 2025, there is that erratic, fast-moving quality, but there seemed to be some kind of guardrail, or whoever could not necessarily put a kibosh on it, but kind of restrain Trump to whatever extent he could be restrained, might have been in place. Now it just seems a lot more brazen. There seems to be less of a... I was never a robust opposition, but like even the facade of one doesn't seem to be there at this point. And as
like
far
that
as
resistance culture is kind of dead.
especially as Democrats seem to be tailing right.
Yeah, and there's a lot of avenues we're seeing with it. Funnily enough, in one of my classes, probably not the one you're thinking of, we talked a lot about kind of rebellion, resistance, and terrorism and whatnot. And we were kind of like, we had a really good discussion about like, kind of as it relates to the State of the Union, what acts of resistance there were meaningful, right? Was the pink suits? Was it the paddle boards? Was it Al Green standing up, right? And like, it was an interesting discussion about like, or was even that like, meeting any meaningful resistance, right? So there's that conversation that my students are having, and like they're kind of having that at the national level too. But the problem is I don't think there's much of anything resembling a coherent strategy from the elite class, right? We see them kind of criticize and ridicule some acts of resistance, but it's not in the name of like, well, like this undermines this broad strategy, right? It's just like, let's just not do this.
Yeah, and it's not even just at the level of responding to it as a news item or how the media handles it on a news cycle basis. It's also within the context of the courts that have to deal with these new moves or aspects of the administrative state that are getting, chopped and screwed quite literally. Having to respond immediately to whatever a harebrained staffer at Doge is up to, right? There's no there was a great episode that just came out on A Lab recently where they were talking about Doge's cutting activities for USAID, and it's almost like the fatal flaw at the heart of the US regulatory state is, what if a dumbass gets your computer and hits Control F and hits woke?
Yeah,
Not that that's the best way to look at it, but
I mean, I was thinking that more so in like the realm of like not USAID, but like which USAID is always how I was pronounced. I don't know why like we're now pronouncing it like the full letter acronym, but whatever.
I'm a dumbass. That's my excuse.
Well, but I mean, like it's like I assume you're doing it because like that's how people have been saying it, which I find baffling. But for that's kind of neither here nor there. But the aspect related to that, I mean, we've seen when it comes to a lot of just anything like related to the government, where it's just like they listed a CIA site for sale in North Carolina.
Oh, the black site thing, yeah,
a black site, but like and it's funny because like we criticize like the bureaucracy, like we as in like society for like being sort of this like unthinking machine, right? Like it doesn't like it doesn't consider nuance. It just acts in a like pre-programmed way that like fails to like kind of calculate, the human part of it. Yet that's exactly how they're doing this, right? They were 100%. Taking out pictures of the Enola Gay because hey, gay, right? Like there's so many like just silly aspects of this that are not being like they're kind of being criticized, but again, it's just like there's so much like we're taking like this sledgehammer to government, and like I think that's the idea in a lot of ways, and I think a lot of what the Doge is doing is just, it's not even just like so much just the flood the zone strategy. It's just like, let's just throw everything at the wall and see what we actually get away with.
Yeah, and I that's probably the horrifying, I won't call it brilliance, but that's the effectiveness of the flood the zone strategy right now. But even when people conceive of like their dream administration, so let's say, I don't know, take yourself back to maybe Bernie 2020, right? The dream is, even if the US empire as we understand it would have to change in some way, there would be a negotiation, there would be a controlled transformation into its next phase. Even the way, a lot of these like Heritage Foundation freaks would talk about it, you would still assume that there was like a managed, negotiated shrinking of the size of the federal government. In practice, it's like, I don't know if this is the right expression, but letting the lunatics run the madhouse is how it's played out effectively. And I almost wonder to what extent the chaos is intentional because it generates a larger spectacle. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of like the good summation of it, right? It's and again, like it's spectacle, but it's spectacle that has a ton of consequences, right? Obviously, if your job is cut, that's, personally hugely consequential. Um, but we're just seeing it like again, it's like a sledgehammer to like not just government, but society in a lot of ways. It feels like, with just like kind of like this crude forcing away of things. Um, Everything is kind of necessitating this like victory lap by them, even before like there's actual like meaningful like change happening, right? It's like, and to the extent that there is meaningful change, that's not really clear to me, other than like, at like the level of like, hey, this is someone who had a job and no longer does. The US aid stuff, we can kind of see where that's probably going. They've made massive cuts to that, through the State Department as well, following up on Musk's recommendations. And it's just like it's fascinating because like again, it's like there's I think these people just like this is like what happens when you have people who like kind of like don't have this governing theory anymore, or like their governing theory is just being a true believer in like the anti-governmentalism in a way that we haven't really had historically. And the reason why that's I think particularly consequential here is that you have some things that we maintained, like historically we always kind of saw like, okay, like whoever's president, like that means something, but there's this whole apparatus that exists behind them, right? That like that keeps things stable. And there seems to be a strong effort to ensure that that is gone now in a way that there definitely, I don't think there really was under Trump's first term, right? There was some things, right, that they tried to like kind of dismantle the apparatus, but nothing to this degree.
Yeah, and even if you look at the culture of layoffs, right? It's populations that you would expect to be loyal or supportive of this kind of thing, and a lot of it is like veterans. So once again,
Yeah.
the pro-veteran party finds a way to betray them once again, and like veterans of federal employment, like what the fuck, man? Like why us? But another lens that I've been looking at this with, and this kind of ties several aspects together. To leave Twitter is one thing. I have been spending an unhealthy amount of time on LinkedIn, as you can imagine. Not really because it's good for finding a job, but because
The political hot takes, right?
I wouldn't. I mean, because the problem with political hot takes these days is it's the hottest of the most lukewarm. So
Oh,
like
yeah.
the vestiges of like DEI professionals like are very on the site, but also this confusion, the kind of corporate put together, educated, trained cohort of American society running up against Doge and Musk. And a lot of these reframe questions I keep getting is like, I thought Musk was an excellent technologist and businessman. What's going on here? And I'm like, oh, we've reached a new synthesis of like vulgar technocracy. And even if you take technocracy to some degree, it is a third appeal to as an ideology, right? It's run it. And Musk has kind of finessed his way for developing any had Bell to Musk's record would kind of know that like he's always been a replacement level programmer. He hasn't particularly been the most skilled engineer. He's not even the most, I'd say, shrewd businessman. He just happened to have finessed things the right way in his potential with obsessed conservatism, right? But that's where we're at, and it's the most bizarre thing to observe. At the same time, though, it's kind of vindicating in the sense of it's not good to be vindicated. Of yeah, what have I been trying to tell you? This guy's not who you thought he was.
Yeah, and I think that's like the frustrating thing, right? Is that like this should have been, I mean, abundantly clear by earlier last year, at the very least, to most of the population, right? I would think at the very least, by the time he acquired Twitter, you had to like realize that like this guy wasn't, it's not operating with full deck, to say the least. Yeah, like it's vindicating seeing people like kind of come along, but it's just weird too, where it's just there's this presumed success that people have that like okay, like that translates, it's sort of it's kind of that Protestant thing, right? That like hard work sort of brings you salvation and whatnot. Therefore, if you are prosperous, certainly that had to have been entirely meritocratic. Even if there's plenty of evidence that that's probably not true.
Yeah.
Especially in this case, right? But like, even like just at a systemic level, we can't really, I don't feel comfortable saying that, we've really, hit that stride of, the successful, like if you're good at your job, success will sort of just kind of come as a result of it.
Yeah.
And I was thinking like
that.
I was gonna say one of my friends real quick said, what was it? He sent me like an old survey from like 2016 because I was thinking like Trump is the exact same way, right? With like, he was a businessman, right? And like this was a survey where it was as far as registered voters, they were asked who the most successful businessman was. 39% said Michael Bloomberg, which I mean, think what you will of his politics, his business acumen's probably a little bit more objective, and then 35% said Trump, which is like again demonstrably untrue.
That's spot on, and like this is what I was kind of thinking of as you were saying this, is like we've been talking a lot about how like in addition to just how polarized everything has become, people are more hyper individualized and they rely on probably the most garbage state of the internet we're in at this point to kind of make up their worldview. It's not really all that different from the criticisms people had of television, in the 90s and 80s, right? And if you think kind of linearly about it, a lot of what we culturally deem to be success in America at this point is more about appearances than actual skill or talent, even though people may profess to value those things. And when you look at things like what passes for podcasts these days, not that we're particularly better, what passes for, I don't know, like business news or alternate media or whatever people are consuming on their phones all day, the people who look the part are seen as legitimate. And if you consider somebody like Trump, whose name itself has been associated with wealth and opulence for quite some time, and you combine that with someone like Musk, whose name has been associated with futurism, advances in technology,
innovation,
yeah. It's I mean, we're at the most absurd level of fake it till you make it. In this case, they continue to fake it well after they've made it. And I don't think anyone is prepared to grapple with what that means societally. I think something I've been fixated on a lot is like the Biden years were prime time to try to maybe address or deal with openly polarization, societal, issues that had really like fissured and ruptured in the Trump years. And it's kind of like unity as the Democrats have conceived of it at this point, is just something you will into being without working on it. And what we haven't addressed is a society that's more divided and more accepting of hucksterism above all else. I don't know what we plan to do to fix this,
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because, like, I mean, I know we have like that sort of opposite discussion usually of the like, like obviously your Ben Shapiro is always like, facts don't care about your feelings, but for a long time we've known that that's like how that party's operated, right? On the notion of like feelings as opposed to reality, and really we have like the two like supreme avatars of that now sitting at the top of the nation, right? That's kind of this is like come full circle.
And two of the most hypersensitive, fragile, narcissistic guys at the head of it.
Oh, 100%.
I'm not talking about you, JD.
Yeah, he's not at the top.
Oh my god. On that note as well, there's been alleged rumors and whispers and editorials and some of the more gossipy political pieces about rifts in Trump world between the sort of Bannonite right-wing Christian circles and the tech what is it, neo-humanist? I wouldn't call them neo-humanist, sorry. Transhumanist, quote unquote.
Whoa! We can't use that.
Shit.
Actually, they'll delete themselves if we use that.
That's let's continue using it.
Well, that came up too because that's a separate thing. But like, there was like the whole transgenic mice.
Oh my god.
But yeah.
But yeah, like the Bannon world versus Musk world, they apparently are keeping things together on the surface, but privately it's another affair. What have you made of those whispers so far?
To be honest, like, and I mean, this isn't like a demarcation, sort of the delay that we've had this. I feel like those whispers have already kind of subsided, right? Like this was like a big push. I think like there's so much of a hope that we'll just see that because I think people have so little faith in like anyone's ability to actually meaningfully stand up to these people that we just hope that they like, off themselves in a maybe in that sense too, but in the sense of like sort of the self-defeating cycle, right? Like where they just fight each other and undermine each other's efforts. And because like I don't know, like I mean we haven't seen any like meaningful consequences at least yet of any efforts to do that, right? It seems like the GOP is uncharacteristically like kind of like the entire like American conservative apparatus seems uncharacteristically disciplined right now, right? Like we avoiding government shutdowns seemingly with the passage of budgets and stuff that they just would not do historically. So like I don't see like I mean do I think a rift could emerge there that like does become something meaningful? Maybe, but I'm also not counting on it.
Yeah, and it's like one thing that we've commented on extensively, and I think seems to be the only objective takeaway anyone can have is that Trump, through his existence, seems to be some kind of disciplining force on the American Republican Party, whether it's a matter of their policy or ideology just to keep him around. It does bring up the question, okay, so what comes after him? But I think you're right. Like, I don't know how much credence to pay attention to some of these rumors because there was some statement Trump put out about Musk after the State of the Union, but at the same time, you still keep the guy around. So how?
Yeah, so there is a different conflict we're seeing as well with Musk and like a lot of the other cabinet secretaries, right? Which is I wouldn't really do it on that like sort of Bannite divide, right? But I think where it exists, it's through kind of more classic like sort of stay in your lane type politics. Like we're like so like Rubio in particular, I guess, like and Trump has been like a weird mediator with these meetings supposedly, with like trying to make sure that everyone's serving the MAGA agenda and whatnot. But like there's been like issues over like like Musk wanting like people to cut more and them not doing it like quick enough and stuff like that. So there is like I'm not necessarily saying that like Rubio is an example of like responsible governance in the Trump administration. I think people thought he would be, and he just isn't. But I think that there was definitely like you're seeing elements of it where it's like I also want to actually like do my job in some way, and slashing the Department of State when we're like trying to go from pole to shining pole or whatever to reinvoke manifest destiny. It doesn't seem overly effective.
It's incredibly hard to read today's Republican Party. I think like some of the court intrigue and some of the more very obvious resentments Trump had in the first term were maybe somewhat more easy to scandalize in the first term, but they were also more pronounced and more self-revealed by Trump. And one thing that I seem to have observed, a lot of people are observing, I'm curious to hear your take on this, is Trump continues to be far more anemic this time around. Still cruel, still vicious, a lot more vindictive and petty this time around. But still somewhat anemic, tired, and willing to delegate this time around. And I'm not sure what that augurs. I'm not sure.
I agree on that. On the pettiness, I feel like the pettiness is less meaningful, if that makes sense.
No,
Like,
that's
so
fair.
like when I think of like the pettiness, like last time around, like I think of like the way he like just like the way he like ran roughshod over his own cabinet,
Yeah.
right? Like think of like your like devoted followers who he just gosh, who was the big one?
Ryan Zinke.
That wasn't who I was thinking. Who was Attorney General? Crap.
William
Jeff
Beauregard
Sessions.
Sessions? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, like Jeff Sessions, right? I mean, like some of the stuff that like caused those rifts was so petty, and like I'm not saying that that won't happen this time around, but like there was a lot more like friendly fire. Now he seems like, I mean, now the pettiness is like making a fuss at the State of the Union that Democrats won't clap for him,
Right.
and stuff like that, or like relitigating his fucking assassination attempt a million times over, which I mean, I don't, I mean like on some level I'm like, well, maybe if like there is like legitimate trauma, like that's just like something that like is a part of that, but I don't know if we want like a traumatized person in the White House regardless of their ideology. But that's a separate argument altogether. But like that's the stuff where I see more of the pettiness. I definitely think that there's like I don't know if it's an interest in like the pursuit of his agenda per se. It feels like that's part of it, but I'm not even sure how much the agenda is like his own, right? Like, I mean, the tariffs seem to be like his idea, but like everything else just kind of seems to be like, yeah, this is like what someone told him to do, and it sounds great.
Yeah, it's very, because on the one hand, what people are talking about is there's no Jared and Ivanka this time around. There's no Steve Mnuchin. There's none of like the first term mainstays that you could
What?
maybe pretend it had some moderating influence. I don't know.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I mean, I guess I kind of forgot Minuchin was kind of thrown into that moderating influence thing, but that is true. There's no one that we're talking about now. There's no real effort to, in my opinion, to humanize Trump in any way, which is kind of refreshing. Um,
Yeah.
like there's not like, oh well, I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing like a million posts from the New York Times pitch bot, right? But there's not like, oh privately, Jared and Ivanka opposed this Trump initiative, right? Which was like, it was the reason they keep posting that is because there were millions of headlines on that. Like every single thing Trump did that, like, oh, privately, Jared and Ivanka like are against what he's doing, as if there was any meaningful like resistance or like moderating influence that they were actually having. But now like you don't see that. We're not talking about I mean, I haven't watched like, a ton of like the mainstream news lately, but like I'm not seeing it in the coverage anymore of the kind of even like just like, oh hey, like let's give him a chance, let's see how things go. Right? Like it seems to be, I had a media brief little kind of interview, I guess, about like if the honeymoon period's over.
Hmm.
And I said yes. I did give him like when he said like is there a consensus definition on when it's over? I'm like, well, the closest we have is pretty reductive, which is it's over when the media says it's over. Um, so like, I'm like I understand that that's not helpful for you, but like because he's like like oh like is it like approval and whatnot? I'm like well like you look at approval, he's arguably never had a honeymoon period. But I think just like as we get like I mean we've had like pretty rapid like just a shift on economic perspectives too, right? Like, I mean, as you said, you consider us to be in a recession.
Mhm.
And it's weird too because like some of the aspects of us being in a recession are completely like policy driven.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like it's like like firing people from the federal government, firing people from like things that might be having contracts with the government, stuff like that. That's more policy driven than like, oh hey, like the COVID stimulus checks may have contributed to inflation, or whatever broader scope you might talk about. Policy influencing economic things. Like, no, this is a case of just like straight up like we are creating bad economic conditions. Like, hey, everyone and their brother has said the tariffs will do this, and we are maybe kind of going to do them eventually, but you know moving target, moving thing. And even like, I mean, the fact that we're even open about it, right? That like Trump's like, hey, there might be some hardship, but we're okay with that, right?
It's entirely confusing the way they're approaching it. Like I forget which cabinet official it was that was like, cheap goods are not the cornerstone of the American dream, and I just remember hearing that and being like, this is the end state American subject, just one that is completely ahistorical in its outlook, completely ignorant of the last couple things that made it. There's a lot of things to be said about how like there's a straight line from Reagan to Trump, not just in terms of ideology, but also like the Reagan tax cuts making Trump who he is. It's beyond our ability to directly analyze, predict, or I mean, of course, we can comment on it and we can talk about how horrible it is because it's true, but this is cutting edge territory. This is they're in the lab cooking up new stuff every fucking day. I've never seen this before.
When I remember, like, there was a lot of people like saying that, like, like we're gonna get the argument from the right that like higher prices are like paying higher prices is patriotic, and like they seem to be really wanting to like make patriotism in again, which is it's just wild to me. Like, and I kind of you mentioned like that we kind of failed to sort of depolarize under Biden, that there might have been a real opportunity to do so, and I'm conflicted on how real that opportunity was, but like accepting that premise for a moment, I'm like, is this like the right's effort to do that? As if we just like America rah 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 all the time, but like to me, like I mean I interact with people across the spectrum to varying degrees. I just don't see where the appetite for this is.
And especially like if you're not online 24/7, you can look around and see people are fucking miserable. Everyone's overworked, everyone's tired. People are getting deported left and fucking right. There's a new fucking disaster every fucking day. It's only the people who have that fucking cruelty within them and feel emboldened by Trump personally to execute that, who this works for. And I think that's the only thing animating this shambling corpse at this point. I don't know if, because it's like you said, I haven't been able to keep up with a lot of stuff. One, because the blitz is working, but two, like it's been overwhelming. CPAC had nothing coherent going on this year. The biggest headline item is Musk getting the fucking chainsaw from Millet.
Oh god. Yeah.
And I don't know. I want to eventually do something about the standing of the tech industry in this new Trump term. Like, why would they make such a point of sitting next to him? We should probably have a discussion about the PayPal mafia and Musk's role within it. And I don't know. This is one of those things that would sound insane a few years ago, but like just seems ever more plausible these days. Is Peter Thiel behind this and Musk the front man? I don't fucking know.
I mean, they're both like uniquely
South African,
yeah, like, and then like they're both like uniquely like incompetent in like the same ways too. So it's like, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't matter who's who's the front man. I mean, I mean, I'm sure Thiel is enjoying the fact that like he doesn't have to actually like put his like financial neck on the line the way Musk
Fair.
has been. But yeah, and I was thinking like from CPAC too. Was this the one that? Because I think we probably should talk about it a little bit. Was this the one that Cenk Uygur was at?
When is he not at it?
I didn't think he was a regular attendee. Well, I mean, like where he actually spoke. Like I didn't think he was a regular attendee.
He is the last person on my radar, but I totally see him being there as a mainline speaker. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the reason I mention it is like it's kind of when we were talking about like bringing like when we bring the show back, like how do we address things, right? And like is it important to criticize the right? Is it important to criticize the response to the right? And the discourse in general? And it was like I think that like and we'll be criticizing like lack of resistance and whatnot, but I'm like if we're just criticizing the lack of resistance without providing any concrete criticisms of our own, it feels a little hypocritical, right?
Oh yeah.
But with Shank's role, so like we've been seeing like TYT just take this far right like drift, right? But like he's been putting this emphasis on, and like it's weird where like ironically enough, like him and like Anna Consparian hate Gavin Newsom, and let's just bring him into it too with his podcast that's I guess out now, where like they hate each other, but like at the same time they're ostensibly like the same, like they're doing the exact same thing, pursuing the exact same strategy of like let's reach out to the right, not because like oh hey like we're missing something culturally, like why are people voting for these guys? It's like no, let's reach out to the quote unquote intellectual gaslighting top of the chain, right? Let's have Gavin Newsom. Let's do our first episode with Charlie Kirk, and I think actually Charlie Kirk was who was interviewing Cenk at CPAC too. Now that I think about it might have been someone else, but like it's like we're doing this thing where it's like I don't like. Are we just like helping the right do a victory lap? And it's just like, oh, well, if we just like concede ground on like, particularly, I mean, the trans issue as well has been consistent with both Cenk and Newsom as well. Right?
Yeah.
Let's throw them under the bus. So, like trans athletes are bad. We don't want them. The right is right about this. And as if that actually, again, where they're like, well, if we concede this, surely they won't step any further than that. And we've seen time and time again, that's not true. And again, it's like, even then with like the argument of the idea of like, well, like we can't fight every battle everywhere, so let's focus on the ones that matter. And this goes for Democratic leadership as a whole too. What are the fights that matter? What fights are we fighting? That to me is fundamentally unclear right now, right? They'll lecture you about, oh yeah, we shouldn't focus on trans athletes, things like that. And like, okay, from a popularity perspective, I somewhat get it. It's an issue where the public isn't really on that side, but also like there's a way to control that narrative better, right? Like emphasizing the fact that like, hey, you know what? Maybe you don't like maybe you think the idea of this is unfair, but also these athletes are basically non-existent. It's not like, oh hey, like so and so's son was like too crappy to make varsity, so he like identified as a woman to like play women's football or whatever, like it's like that's not what's happening, like which is the constant narrative. But like you have to like they keep falling to this trap of like we have to like play it by their narrative rules, and it just leads to this further extrapolation of these problems,
which is the whole premise of greenhouse gaslighting as we've conceived of it, right? Like why the fuck are you playing on someone else's rules? To that end of like what fights matter. I mean, I've definitely been of the mind. It's like I don't think they're putting up a concrete fight, period.
Yeah.
But the decision to begin tailing rightwards that had, you can't even say that this began under Biden, although the most stark example is the cut right on immigration, right?
Yeah, I kind of, I mean, I agree on the immigration point. I kind of want to like emphasize though that a lot of this is kind of tainted by a recency bias.
I agree. That's fair. That's
Because like
completely
I mean
fair.
like let's I mean like obviously like like certainly like I mean like Bill Clinton's a better example of like Democrats kind of veering to the right
Yeah.
and whatnot, and like we can look at other instances too, but I think like in terms of like where we're seeing, I mean I think some of it is that like, and it's part of that recency bias. We're just so used to like Democrats and like the quote unquote left not being empowered. So
Yeah.
like the failures of the Biden administration to enact certain things, regardless of the logistics behind why or why not they did or didn't do certain things, are why it increases our frustration.
I take that point. That point is taken well. So maybe on the subject of fights that matter, do we want to get into the Volodymyr Zelensky humiliation ritual that happened in the White House?
Oh my God, yeah.
That was painful.
Who was humiliated here though is the question that I'm wondering about.
Everyone watching, everyone fucking watching.
Yeah. So this is obviously, it's been a couple weeks at this point. This was baffling, right? So Zelensky's here doing his usual, like, hey, lobbying, like, trying, like, help us fight the good fight. When not, we continue to need U.S. aid. And during this, that seemed to be the inciting incident was him saying that if Russia defeated Ukraine, the West would feel the impact. And Trump just flew off the rails. You can't say how we'll feel. How dare you? Just goes on like this frankly like crybaby tirade. JD Vance jumps in like, have you ever said sorry? Have you ever said thank you, Mr. Zelensky? And
God.
just like it's childish. It was. I know that they have sold it as like this is a projection of power, right? This is the U.S. standing up for itself, and I can't fathom having my brain fried enough to see it that way. It's like you looked like a baby. This isn't a projection of strength. Like a projection, like I mean I don't know what like a projection of strength is like complaining that like I'm trying to prevent World War III by like sacrificing you to the enemy. Like what have you done? Like that's I just don't see how that's like. And even then, like when you think about their classic projections of strength, right? It's like, hey, bombing some civilians, right? That's a projection of strength. And this isn't even that. Like I'm not saying that like, oh yeah, like we should bomb civilians to do that, but it's like this was just bad. It was like I was telling like friends and colleagues, I'm like, this had to be like one of the most like embarrassing things to ever happen in the White House.
Yeah.
Just in terms of like, again, we know this stuff happens like behind the scenes, like constantly. But like, especially under like the first Trump administration, right? Read any number of tell-all books.
Right.
You'll hear like plenty of anecdotes of this, but he usually doesn't do that when the cameras are on, right? Like he's a different kind of inflammatory there, but not usually like this.
Yeah, and I don't know where the Republican policy on Ukraine comes from. I know that there's always been this weird like love-hate thing for Putin. There's always Russophobia, but Putin's not gay, so we love him type shit.
Yeah.
At the same time, like, and I'll admit this is like, I have not exactly been the biggest quote unquote fan of this war. I was particularly, put off by like people trying to play at conflict or war expertise on social media. I didn't necessarily like the real return to like a kind of Cold War militarized mindset, and more importantly, I kind of didn't like that there was this dichotomous view of the war of like you're either with Ukraine or with Russia, and a general opinion of resenting that there's a war at all. Just kind of there was no place for that. Of course, I don't know how you would express that politically, but within the
Yeah, I mean,
discourse. Yeah,
I think the place for it had always just kind of been like co-opted, I think, by the like the Russian side. You know what I mean? Where it's
to some
like,
extent, yeah.
like that. I think that was like to the extent that that sentiment existed in the U.S., it was just sort of co-opted in like, you know, more or less in like the Russian perspective as like the
Yeah.
prevailing version of it.
Yeah, and it's like the sense I had always gotten at the start of the conflict, and even now, is that the United States had always set up Ukraine to be a proxy, had no intention of really stepping in when things got dire for the Ukrainians, and was always going to leave them out to dry. I think, and I don't know how much you buy this. I don't really know how much I buy this because, again, I just generally regret conflict when it happens.
I was gonna ask you what wars are you a fan of, but not really. But when you're like when you open up with that, that smoldering hot take if you're not a fan of a conflict.
uh, I mean, you could argue that there might have been a point where it's like Russia could have been brought to the table to capitulate to some extent. I don't know how realistic that was. And even now, right? Let's say, and I'm not an international relations guy, so I could be completely talking out of my ass here. If there was a desire to shift policy, why wasn't there some kind of summit to be hosted to, I don't know, have the United States negotiate an end to the conflict? I don't think that, you'll ever get Teddy Roosevelt putting an end to the Russo-Japanese War, like type of thing. I don't think that would happen.
No.
But like you could at least pretend you had the fig leaf of international norms under that kind of approach. But to kind of just reduce it to, oh, I saw you with Joe Biden and I hate you. And then again, there's critiques to be had of the late stage Ukrainian handling of the war. Not my place to comment on it. But to kind of, and this goes back to like what we were talking about with how we handle the regulatory state, right? There's no negotiated exit. There's no controlled exit. There's no controlled implosion. It's just a very borderline split of we're done. We're done with you. We don't care. And that's not really how anything works. You kind of have to manage the exit.
Yeah, and it's like one of those things where like on some level, I don't think we'll ever know at what point, there was a viable opportunity for a summit or anything like that, right? I think
Yeah.
a lot of it is contextual and information that is probably classified, right?
Yeah.
Or better known by like the people like in both camps, right? And
Hmm.
it's hard to say, right?
Exactly.
Do
It's
I
like I
think
have
there
no
was
ability
ever
to. Yeah.
Yeah, like do I think there was an earnest effort to facilitate peace under Biden? Maybe near the end. I honestly think at first, like, I don't know, so, I'm not gonna say there was necessarily a desire to see the conflict like propagated, but I think that um, the foreign policy calculation in part was like, especially like as the war dragged on, that like Russia is getting decimated, and like this was a fact check, was like, were they technically decimated, because like decimation means like reduced to like a particular fraction, and like the answer was yes, they have. Their armed forces have been decimated by their commitment to that conflict. And I think that on some level, the foreign policy apparatus was definitely taking a victory lap in that, right? Like maybe I think that there might have been a shift towards like, okay, like mission accomplished. Let's just let's secure those gains, perhaps. I don't know. And again, like I don't necessarily know that we ever will, but I definitely think that at least on some level, there was an embracement of the fact that like this is, I mean, probably far worse for Russia than like Afghanistan was for us, or even Vietnam, right? Like, I mean, Vietnam, certainly was embarrassing, but like, I don't think, the death tolls and like, just the damage to like our armed forces, like quite meets the level that it technically meant for the Russians.
I mean, it's just been a nasty, brutal fucking war. I just
Yeah.
nothing about this can even be you know, you can't even pretend to put the fig leaf of heroism on this. This has just been brutal.
Sure.
And it's like, again, it's like, I don't know how much I can co-sign Biden or Blinken's approach to this conflict, but to kind of have the two dumbest guys, yell at Zelensky over something that was negotiated to a previous, and this ties back to what we were talking about in the last episode, right? Which is like, there's no reason to really trust the United States on any foreign policy issue anymore, right? You could go as far back as like, what have the Kurds been telling you? But then at the flip side of that, right, is like, I mean, the Iran deal, Cuba, and even down to like the weird theory I had of like, is business greasing the wheel between states when U.S. foreign policy came out?
For particularly Israel Palestine.
Right. Like, I just don't understand tanking the fig leaf of decency or legitimacy the United States had on the international stage. You could argue it never had it, right? But like, to just nakedly go mask off and be like, we actually are under no obligation to honor any agreement.
Right, and I mean, some of it's like related to the U.S. aid stuff as well, right? Where it's just like this acknowledgement, like, or not necessarily acknowledgement, like, but this belief that like soft power doesn't mean anything, that we just, who cares, right? And like, certainly like abandoning all these international agreements. And again, this was kind of, happened under the first Trump administration. And that, to be fair, Biden probably deserves credit for restoring like any level of, semblance that people actually could meaningfully engage with the U.S. on a international basis then. But I mean, immediately those countries were kind of screwed when Trump got back in office.
Right.
I mean, obviously when it comes to the tariffs, right, targeting our closest allies, both in a like, physical and metaphysical sense, right? When we say closest allies, like, and then it's wild too, where you look at some initiatives like, oh, we got to build an Iron Dome, which again only works for like short range missiles and whatnot. Which, I mean, okay, I guess if we're gonna piss off our closest allies geographically, maybe we do need an Iron Dome. I don't know. But it's just to no like clear benefit. And if you're someone, if you're a foreign nation, like, I mean, you kind of have to play the US's rules in the sense that we are this, sort of unipolar power for now. But like, there's an extent that you don't have to, right? And maybe this does drive countries closer to China. And I mean, really, I guess China is really the only other like substantial rival that we have on that level at this point, right? And it's certainly not Russia. I know the brief flights of fancy that Brazil was going to become an international power, I think, faded a long time ago. But
I don't know. This again just ties back to what we were saying about the ahistoricism of it all, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you talk about tariffs on China? Which, again, the tariff as a method, it doesn't make sense here, right? But how do you talk about trade war with China completely divorced from the special relationship between China and the United States when it comes to manufacturing and consumption? How do you talk about any of that without mentioning Deng Xiaoping or Richard Nixon once? Doesn't make sense to me. How do you talk about, disputing trade with Canada and Mexico without invoking Bill Clinton or NAFTA even once? It doesn't, it's just like, if you want to renegotiate the system, that's one thing. It's not even renegotiation. And something that had kind of been sticking in my mind, I wrote this down in the outline. So former Ambassador Chaz Freeman was on this podcast. And he had this take. Well, first he has this funny suspicion that the Greenland minerals thing and the Ukraine minerals thing is something Lindsey Graham must have like blurted out to Trump at some point that Trump has taken seriously for whatever reason. I don't know. I
thought it had to have been like Elon or or Thiel, like one of those guys who I thought it had to originate from. But I mean, maybe Lindsey Graham too. Who knows?
I would like to see how that game of telephone happened. That's for certain. But Um, he had this take that was kind of incredibly sober and measured for understanding what went down there, which is take a look at this as a landlord trying to kick out a tenant in the context of like a client state in America's foreign policy apparatus, right? You have to look at Trump in his perspective, at least from Freeman's perspective, as a real estate executive first and foremost, and his entire, approach to foreign policy and domestic policy is kind of based on him being a scumbag landlord, right? You just get out of contracts. He has a history of stiffing contractors. He has a history of stiffing businesses and people who worked for him. He has a history of trying to get out of deals that he didn't deem personally advantageous, liquidating properties as quick as he can. Ironically, Musk's career also tracks in that regard, but maybe I'm just seeing coincidences. Who's to say?
No, I mean, I think that that mentality has to be there, right? Because I mean, it tracks way too nicely onto their the way they've been operating in politics, right? Just it's too perfect for it not to be at least somewhat reflective.
And we saw it all culminate at the State of the Union. Now, I cannot say that it will be the worst thing that has happened to me this year, but that was probably in the top 3 worst things I've had to endure this year.
A year in which you were laid off.
I mean, okay, first of all, the overarching thing of when is he going to shut the fuck up with this? It was the longest State of the Union on record now, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, between the State of the Unions and joint addresses, which this technically was, right? It wasn't a proper State of the Union because it's the year he was elected, but still more or less the same. The longest one on record. I don't know what percentage of that was based on the fact that every line that was uttered was a standing ovation. Not just a clap.
Dick riding was crazy.
Is it because was the fact they had to stand up? Was it to simulate the dick riding? I don't know, but it was really every line was a standing O. Every single one.
The worst part of it is looking at Mike Johnson and JD just sit down in their chairs and then get up for every line. I'm like,
yeah.
I can't imagine doing box squats all night. That seems crazy. In loafers and slacks, nonetheless. That seems insane. But I mean, it was just a recapitulation of all his grievances from the campaign trail this time around, as well as 2016 and 2020. It was just him replaying the greatest hits, doing a Trump rally for the entire Republican bench, basically. And it was, we can talk about whether or not the Democrats put up a successful show of disapproval, but I call this jug hooting ex-fascism from the Republican aisle. It was, they're getting excited for shit that doesn't even add up.
Yeah. In terms of substance, right? I don't think this was the most substantive speech we've ever had.
Not the least at all. Exactly. Yeah.
But it's just weird pauses, and again, it's sort of I mentioned at the start of this, at the start of this administration, right? How much of just him being in office is going to be treated as a victory, right? They pitch this all as America is back. Not it's coming back; it's already back. We've ended woke. We've ended all these supposedly really bad things. We've entered a new golden age of prosperity. Not in the process of we're just there. We have made it. We've reached the top of the mountain. And we had USA chance. Just very just again, like just very much this is like structured as ostensibly a rally, except with like all of the attendees being like, I guess, better dressed than the average Trump rally attendee, right? Like that's the only difference.
I and on that note too is like the patent absurdity of it all, you know. Most State of the Unions I mean, even this one followed the general pattern, right? Of I'm very cynical, as you can tell. You know, I like to view State of the Unions more so as shareholder meetings than anything else. And the goal is to
A little more
accomplish,
public than those, but sure.
and you know, the goal is always, you know, to kind of like highlight as many achievements for that term as you can. Um, I can't imagine. You can always argue that like you're always tooting your own horn, you're always embellishing at a State of the Union, but this was among the most patently absurd ones because you can't even, aside from inflicting as much cruelty as possible and making someone get hurt and validating all of his diehard supporters, you still can't exactly point to anything as a immediate success on the terms he's built for himself. That's my own take. I guarantee are 100% patently false. It was all bluster. It was all for show. And when you get down to like the kind of, you know, they always bring out examples of people who benefit
Yeah.
from the policies that they're trying to institute. These aren't even people who you could argue directly benefit in any way at all, you know, other than like these are just the foot soldiers of like the Trump worldview, Trump ideology. And I mean, there was that we already had our own discussion about how parading the kid around who had like the treatment for a brain cancer, right? How undignified and just ableist that is in its own context, right?
Well, especially when we've like defunded like the same initiatives that paid for, you know, the research.
That's
that
exactly what I was getting to.
life.
Yeah.
Yeah, like you had that. You had God, I can't remember her name, but the woman whose like athletic career in volleyball was ended supposedly by a trans woman, which I had taken the story at least at like face value, but apparently there's dispute over the entirety of it. Supposedly she actually still participated in athletics after that injury. Supposedly there's no confirmation that the athlete was even trans. Because I had just assumed like it had just so happened to be, but like people endure career-ending injuries in athletics all the time, right? Even in solo sports, right? It just happens. It's like, you know, it's a consequence of those things. But apparently there's even disputes over whether like any of like that story is true. You had the Lincoln Riley family there because like, hey, yeah, we'd passed this, you know, anti-immigration bill because you know your daughter was killed, and again, like it's like there's like we have these tragedies that happen, and like, yeah, like I'm not like there's no reason to pretend that like that wasn't a tragedy, right? But we're only inspired to like act, or at least that side's only inspired to act when there's like some broader like agenda that they can tie into it, right? Like the fact that this happens domestically all the time, that people are senselessly murdered, doesn't mean anything unless we can tie it to like another racial or ethnic group, or immigrants, so that we can like, okay, this is something that's fine to legislate away, but other systemic violence against students, against anyone else, we're our hands are tied. We can't do anything.
It was just, again, it was a full court display of, and again, it's hilarious that the cohort that tried to usher in Trump, the one that chastised weakness and victimhood and and, you know, the kind of frailty of what they deem to be hegemonic liberal culture have just basically plugged themselves into it. They weren't really upset about weakness. They just wanted their turn to be the victim. If such a thing even exists, you know? That's what this is at the end of the fucking day, and it's disgusting to watch. In addition to that, I don't know. I'm not sure what you could even expect the Democrats to do in the chamber. I would have preferred if they all just boycotted it. That would have been. Can they even compel you to show up to the State of the Union?
No, they can't. And there was, to be fair, there was internal discourse within the party on what the best response was. Some people did boycott it. There was clear divide, and you could tell that like this wasn't even something that like factionally was something that was like cohesive, right? Like I think AOC boycotted it, but like Tlaib and Omar were there. So like it's not like, you know, I mean, to the extent that the squad is a meaningful coalition anyways, but like, you know, it's not like, oh hey, like it's, you know, the more left-wing members were in favor of boycotting versus like not, right? There's just it was a mixed consensus on that. There was a mixed consensus on, you know, like a lot of the women that wore pink suits. There was, you know, there are little paddle boards with like, you know, false or, you know, save Medicare, Medicaid, all that stuff, Social Security. And people, you know, like some people found them cringy. Some people, I think my student consensus was, even from the people who did like it, they came around to the fact that they thought it was cringy, which was not something I pushed them to. That was just something they're like, hey, I take back my words. It was cringe. But, you know, so someone were doing that. Obviously, Al Green stood up and, you know, shouted and got kicked out as a result.
Did he say fuck Trump? Is that what he got kicked out for?
I'm not sure if that was the reason. He was. I know like the main stuff. I don't remember if he said that explicitly, but I do remember he had said something about like you have no mandate to cut Social Security and Medicaid.
The thing that Trump campaigned on, the thing he campaigned on, that he wouldn't cut it.
Yeah, well, he campaigned that he wouldn't cut it, right? Yeah, so it's like, yeah, clearly, I mean, to the extent that mandates are real, you know, I would consider that to be like the opposite of a mandate.
Right.
Like that would be like if he, you know, implemented like a really like robust like open border policy, right? Like that, close enough to that in terms of like just the opposite of what he was, you know, campaigning on.
Yeah, and even on that point too, right? Like kicking Al Green out. I mean, he did way less than like the average Republican congressman during an Obama State of the Union did,
or Biden State of the Unions, right?
That too, yeah.
Just look at last year and like the year before that. It's like, you know, Green and Boebert have been doing this for like their entire time in Congress.
MTG, you mean, in this case, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess that is awkward. In that case, yeah, they're, you know, MTG, Marjorie Taylor Greene, not Al Green. But anyways, like what I was like saying with like all those types of protests was that like even any of those things were also considered like we shouldn't do this by a lot of Democrats, right? Some Democrats felt they should do nothing. They should attend. They should do nothing more than that. They don't have to clap. They don't have to applaud, but they should be there and do nothing.
Which is a very, again, because the one thing I remember at the start when they were ushering everyone in, I forget, I think it was some representative from Massachusetts, she had like a sign that said, "This is not normal." And it almost felt like a re-invocation of like the 2016 resistance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to kind of quickly make sure that she was out of frame, I think they even pushed her out. When they did cut the camera over to the Republicans, like, or sorry, to cut the camera to the Democrats. Sorry. It was all just kind of like haphazard, and even just like the whole like self-victimization thing they did of like, oh my god, the Democrats didn't clap or cheer for us, and they were so mean. I don't know what else could have been done. I personally am of the mind that's like, why go, period, but I can definitely see how coming from that Trump won mindset and maybe just this kind of like liberal affectation of you must bear witness to horrible things played into that. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think again, like it's one of those things where like, just in the public, we don't necessarily have like a cohesive view of what resistance looks like.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely think, I'm fine with the spectrum that was on display, and as far as like, some level of resistance. I definitely
Yeah.
think the people who are like, we should just do nothing, though, I think that's like what's the point? Like what like again, like I understand picking and choosing your battles. But as leadership, your job is to indicate what battles should we be picking.
Yeah.
Right? This isn't a covert op in the sense of like, oh well, if we expose the enemy what battle we plan on fighting, that might undermine our cause, right? Like people are looking for some level of inspiration, and like there was the interview of Hakeem Jeffries a few weeks before that,
Yeah.
right, where
Yeah.
he had said like, oh, like what leverage do we even have? And to be honest, I don't necessarily know what leverage they have either per se, right? Okay, maybe with the budget they might be able to leverage something in the Senate, who knows? But like I'm not necessarily convinced that like they have a ton of things they can do, but as the leader of the party, it's your job to find out something that you can do, or at least pretend that you have something in
Yeah.
mind, right? And this kind of just like lay down and like, okay, yeah, well, like the majority of the public elected Trump, which I mean, not the majority of the public, but at least like, hey, the electorate, as far as this election is concerned, he was more popular than Kamala Harris. And there's not like a strong reconciliation with what that even means yet, right? It's just this fixation on, the how can we find the Joe Rogan of the left, which has been this like ongoing trope with like the way we're doing, hey, this is why Gavin Newsom has to have his own podcast, right? Can he
Right.
be the Joe
Right.
Rogan of the left? Which is, I would think to do that, you would need to, I don't know, have hosts who aren't, right wing, or guests that aren't right wing, in order to be the Joe Rogan of the left. But whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's just the struggle for it, and I get like it's a real. There's not a clear answer in terms of like what resistance can or should look like, but I think we can all come to the consensus is that it should look like something, at the very least, right? It should be something.
Yeah, and I think like I don't know, the explanation that's been given to me by like explicitly liberal or more strongly democratic party loyalist friends and family I've had over the years, right, is like the trauma of the response to Reagan still lingers large for the Democrats. And they're also personally hamstrung by the embrace of third way politics. So it begs the question. And then also, we've talked again about, like, within neoliberalism, you have that blinkered worldview. You always foreclose what options exist. So when you foreclose everything and one entity seems to be taking control of the system, I don't know how sincere or calculated the attempt to, if you can't beat them, join them is, but that's the only vocal contingent right now, and it's not exactly one I can personally endorse, nor is it one that I think is as popular as it's made out to be. Now, I don't know what's popular anymore. But and again, it's like you said with the hyperfixation on the Joe Rogan of the left and like podcasts and media, it's very telling, right? That's like for all these allegations of like liberal control over the media, how much of that is true versus how much of that is a pejorative from the right. How did they miss that? How did they miss the opportunity to build stronger, more cohesive infrastructure to keep a friendly ideology, in the public conscious? Is it because it would expose their past failures or their complicitness in like societal errors? I don't know. I don't fucking know. But you are right that there's no coherent response aside from the elements that are tailing right. So we can talk about maybe some of the responses to the State of the Union I think the big one from Slotkin, um, I didn't see the online discourse about this. I know that the line she had about being a Cold War kid drew a lot of ire. I'm kind of like, she's a CIA agent. What did you expect her to say? Not that I'm endorsing that. I'm just, like
Right. Yeah. Like, so yeah, it was like specifically, it was, the line, as a Cold War kid, I was glad that, Reagan was president, not Trump, which, it's kind of like a lack of imagination, right? Like your choice is Reagan or Trump. Who would you rather have?
Especially when there's a straight line from Reagan to Trump.
Right. And it's the strategy that Democrats have been pursuing, and this is, I think it was really highlighted in the last cycle, right? Was the fact that like they're trying to get at like, we want Republicans to feel like good about themselves and their past choices while like, self-correcting on their course, right? Like you were correct to, support Ronald Reagan, to support all of his policies, but you're wrong to continue to support Trump. So you should come along with us. And it's, like the thing is, it's, people are like, oh, let's look at the past 20 to 30 years. This has failed. You don't have to look at that far. You can just look at last year. This was proven as an ineffective strategy. And I would say, I mean, I'm not even sure, like prior to 24, that they ever pursued this strategy as aggressively as they did, to be honest, with like the Cheneys and everything like that, where it's just sort of this emphasis on the apparatus. And we've known from some donor meetings, which were, closer to those shareholder meetings you were talking about, where they're not public, but we've, of course, stuff leaks to the press and whatnot. And we know that like there's a push from a lot of Democrats to kind of focus on some of that more centrist style messaging, right? With some particular emphasis on like trying to reclaim patriotism. And again, it's like all these aesthetic choices that were made in the last cycle that have no evidence of helping a single voter. And I again, it's like, this Slotkin approach, that was really the focus of the online discourse, right?
Yeah.
Her speech was otherwise, it was short. I don't have a problem with that necessarily. I think that, for better or worse, this is probably more of the least talked about State of the Union responses, right? Usually, like they're talked about for being like cringe and bad in various ways, right? Rubio's known for reaching for the glass of water.
Right.
Katie Britt's last year with like, being in the kitchen looking like a fucking serial killer the entire time.
Yeah.
Like usually these are like just like the source of like memes and stuff like that. And, that's not going to be the case this time. There's good aspects of that. There's probably bad aspects of that too, right? Like, I don't think this is going to really, no one that watched this, I think, felt inspired. It was just pretty anemic. And I think it's just, it was, and even, like from our political persuasion, other than maybe those lines that we already talked about, pretty inoffensive too, right? Like it didn't inspire, it didn't offend, it was just there. And is that what we're shooting for? I can hear you now.
Okay, I can hear you too. I don't know what happened. What was the last thing you heard?
You were asking me about the I think the immigration line and a few other things related to that.
See, I'm telling you, the deep state is suppressing us. So where I think I was at was even within the content of Slotkin's response, there was no fundamental challenge on immigration. There was no real challenge on economic policy. Just the kind of like, we know the cost of living is bad, but just like a kind of lukewarm acknowledgement. And I can't remember what else I was saying, but what I was trying to steer it towards was, because I noticed a little bit of this in Bernie's response to the State of the Union as well. I'm curious what your take is on this. Do you think there's an allergy or just a fear of any strategy that would involve admitting policy missteps or admitting the Democratic Party's hand in unpopular policies, as well as repudiating the right entirely.
Yeah, on the first point, I'm going to say I'm not convinced there are any political benefits to admitting mistakes. Like, you know what I mean? Like from a like pure like electoral politics perspective, I don't know that like it's good or like even remotely helpful to admit your mistakes and whatnot. I'm not saying that's a good thing,
Okay.
but I think when it comes to the repudiation aspect, and it's kind of related to that too. I think what they're really struggling with right now is that they're trying to weave this difficult line of like okay, some policies that the right has are in fact more popular on immigration. I think that's kind of what you're saying on like at least the trans athlete issue, where it's like, yeah, like public sentiment is not on side of these things, so do we stand up and fight for them? Do we just try to like kind of co-opt-ish the thing, right? Where like, in Slotkin's response on immigration, she mentions like, we do need to do something about it, but like not in this like, unstrategic way, like, kid running with scissors style approach that the Trump administration is taking, right? That's more or less like the synthesis of a response. And I think that's where we're kind of struggling with that dynamic right now, as like with the party as a whole. I think they're really kind of trying to weave the line of like, how can we reconcile like unpopular support while not fully endorsing the other side's approach to it, even if that is the more popular policy route at this time.
Yeah, because it would also I also don't know if admitting mistakes is a useful strategy, right? But this just kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, right? Of how do you talk about...
I was going to say real quick, I was like, maybe that's kind of back to what we talked about at the start of this, of feeling vindicated. Is that just what it's going to be? It's just like, sort of petty vindication that like, aha, we knew you were wrong.
I mean, that definitely is it. You're definitely spot on there, but like, it's just the thing, right? Where how do you talk about these whack ass approaches to dealing with Canada and Mexico without addressing NAFTA and Bill Clinton? But then if you think about that, yeah, of course Trump doesn't want to address that. But then counterpoint, like, maybe it is, yeah, like the Democrats would have to sorely reckon with their entire history if they had to open that can of worms up. More than that too, I guess, like, I don't know, if considering that we're a gerontocracy at this point, how many people would have to sit there and raise their hand and be like, yeah, I was complicit in that? I don't know. But that's the only way I guess I can process this personally, is just like, you would have to look at yourself in the mirror if you're a member of the Congress at this point and be like, yeah, I had a hand in this. Do I accept responsibility, or am I going to continue scapegoating and ducking around and throwing other people under the bus so I don't have to accept it? I don't know, but and I guess that's the thing. It's like, that's not how politics is played. Even if it would fix things, I don't know if that's going to translate into electoral success. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. So I didn't see the Sanders response, but how would you evaluate that?
It's
bear in mind, like, for the context, like, for listeners, this was not like a Democratic sponsored response. The Slotkin one was, so more people did watch the Sanders one, I know, but this wasn't necessarily what the party intended people to see.
I mean, it was a lot of like classic Bernie. If you were a fan of Bernie in 2016, 2020, it invoked a lot of those notes, but
sure,
there's two classes of former Bernie supporters. They're the people who can forgive or tolerate his cooperation with Biden the past 4 years, and then there are the people who feel betrayed or feel frustrated or just done with that brand of politics at this point. I'm still parsing my feelings on the subject because the handy lie I've told myself is he's a hostage at gunpoint. You can't take anything he says to heart. But then on the flip side, and this is maybe my most cynical read, right, is a lot of punditry and a lot of ink has been spilled about, well, you need people like AOC and Bernie in the Democratic Party because they can push it left. But personally, I've seen them shift right, maybe on issues like Israel or the economy or what have you, right? So,
well, we've seen,
yeah.
I think on some votes, we've seen that. I don't know if we've seen that as like a whole from like an ideological split, but we've definitely seen them kind of engage more in like politicking.
Yeah, and I think that's the question is, do you think that politicking has been a net benefit, or is it something that has not yielded the results that was promised? I tend towards the latter, but at the same time, I can't say with 10 toes down they should have formed their own party. You need numbers to even consider doing something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, you kind of need numbers to do, within the party too,
Yeah.
to accomplish what they want. And I mean, I don't know if I wouldn't say describe this as charitable on the front of like what you're talking about specifically vis-a-vis like like been taking votes that have been a little more controversial. Has that netted any benefits? I'm also not like I don't necessarily know if that's true, but I'm also not necessarily convinced it's been like overly costly, other than like sort of psychologically to the online left. Like, because even then, like, I'm not like saying that, like, oh, like the things that they're voting on has no consequence, but like the things that they voted on in a lot of cases didn't need their vote, right? It's like some of the votes on I think like one of the more controversial ones that AOC did pretty early was like voting on like funding for like the Iron Dome or something in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's like that was gonna pass one way or the other, like. Is it like upsetting on a personal level? Sure, but like, is it like how consequential is it one way or the other? Like, is it necessarily getting her benefits? Hard to say. She also hasn't been in Congress very long, right? Normally it's like years of this shit before something happens, which is frustrating. Probably for her, for sure, as someone who's like trying to build a political career, but like frustrating for people who want results too. So it's hard to say, but I'm also not convinced that like the activities they've engaged with have been overly costly, other than from a kind of more puritanical perspective on ideology.
I mean, and that's the thing, is I personally think that ideological purity is whatever, how do I say this? How someone defines that will determine their outlook on a lot of things.
Sure.
Some people hold on to it to ridiculous extremes, but then some people, I mean, you see this now where like people are just acting without ideology. They'll shift their beliefs every 5 seconds. So what do you make of politics like that?
I also kind of make that out of like the average person's politics too,
exactly
right?
Exactly. Like most Americans don't have coherent ideology at that extent. I mean, here's the thing, there's always been a divide between what's considered the electoral left and then the not, like, elements of the left that don't necessarily prescribe to that. They may see other routes of activism, trade unionism, protest, direct action as their paths forward, right?
Hopefully, because I mean, some of them I think just like to complain.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like I'm never talking about internet leftists at this point. I'm not
sure.
I'm on LinkedIn, dog. I don't see any of you there, and I'm not even saying that as a flex. I I have a different kind of brain rot now. But
If someone here has a job, Adi's looking, you get it. Like,
please hire me at the leftism factory. I will do the leftism for you. Uh, with that being said, though, like, I think the question has always been, can you get the straight jump to desperately needed redistributive or progressive policy by getting those people in office, and through accruing those members, they will have what they need to kind of take over institutions that are hostile to that. I don't know if the gamble was sane to begin with. But I think again, it's like the calculus of Bernie 2016 and Bernie 2020 has long been, unfortunately and sadly, disproven, right? I'm not proud of that, right? I don't think you can elect your way out of third way politics and the kind of death grip of the Democratic Party on the left at this point. What it will take. Well, go ahead.
I don't want to say that I'm like super optimistic that it can be, but I think that like Sanders illustrates the difficulty of it, right? And I think like, okay, you look at 16, you look at 20. In some ways the coalition grew, in other ways it didn't, right? And I think that like what we found is, I think we've struggled to make it sustainable. I mean, who knows what we'll see in 28. But I think that like, and unfortunately, right, the reality is like, yeah, I think that a lot of the non-electoral political engagements that the left can do are vitally important, right? But also like a lot of the stuff that like has been happening under the Trump administration has kind of shown real challenges with that, like, too, right? It's like, well, you do need some people in government on some level to hold these people in check, and it's kind of it's a double-edged sword.
It is, and I think also what that speaks to more broadly is like, what are the conditions on the ground, not just for the left, but like for the average American subject? What does ideology look like on average? What are the material forces and conditions in the American perspective 2025? You can't inherently will people to adopt a certain brand, and let's just call it this kind of like resuscitation of like SDS style social democracy, right? Like, you can't just get people to adopt it through social media engagement and media, as we've been seeing, right? Like, again, we're criticizing the Democrats for their kind of hyper obsession with platforming the right and using podcasts as this new medium to engage the voting public. We'll see how that pans out. But that's...
Well, I was gonna say real quick, it's funny because like you were talking about like the hyperfixation on platforming the right, because I remember the opposite once upon a time, right? Where it was the hyper obsession with like platforming the right, but like as a bad thing, right? Like we're like, oh, if Bernie Sanders shows up on, I don't know if Fox News was ever thinking he showed up, but when he showed up on Joe Rogan,
AOC refused to show up to a Michigan rally because of that. That's like a true story.
Yeah, and it was like where there was the outrage that he, and again, it's like I it's like a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of what platforming means. What Newsom is doing is platforming, right? He controls the platform. He is exposing people who, if they're, someone who probably liked Newsom's politics, I would say they're probably not someone who was really watching Charlie Kirk or Steve Bannon or any of these other folks, right? So that is exposing them to a new platform. It's not platforming when you go into enemy territory for someone who has a much bigger audience than you to, argue with them. But there was that long obsession with it, and now it's just weird where it's like now we're like doing like the exact thing that we were like apparently outraged about, but even worse than the way we were outraged about it over.
Exactly, and I think that's one of many just new norms that are unfortunate developments in this new environment. And even when you look at other just takes coming out of the Democratic Party, I think I just added these as additions, right? You had Ezra Klein's bizarre interview with Jake Auchincloss, where it's just like, let's just do neoliberalism on steroids. You had this new interview come out with Fetterman, where Fetterman's like, yeah, no one wants to be my friend because I said we should nuke Palestine. Like it's just bizarre shit. And then when you get down to
on Fetterman too, I don't know if you've seen like the recent reports that like he's kind of like apparently like has built his whole like political arsenal around just being contrarian. That like the only reason he like has gone in as hard on Israel as he has is because like he found out it was like upsetting like online leftist activists and stuff like that,
which were like his biggest online constituency once upon a time. I don't know how.
Right, like I can get like like I mean obviously like the desire to troll and whatnot. Like I can understand that. Like that seems to have been pretty successful for the right. But I don't understand like the approach he's opted to take, which is like this would be like if Trump like explicitly antagonized his base, and not in a way of like, oh, his politics like might hurt them, like in a way that like he's just like rhetorically like, you culture war idiots, like you don't know anything, just like was just incredibly vicious towards them.
It's almost like a Kristen Cinema effect, not to bring her up again, right? But it's like the weird affectation of like this art. I'm not saying this as a pejorative against arts teachers, right? But like this kindergarten art teacher aesthetic in the Senate, tippy toeing and like doing this weird curtsy to go vote against like making
wage.
Drug access more approval. I think whatever it was back then, right? And then like for Fetterman to do the same thing, where it's just like, I don't give a fuck about wearing a suit. I'm just gonna claim I'm depressed. Maybe he is. I hope he is for what he's been doing. But just again, just being like this dipshit contrarian for no fucking reason. I don't get it.
Well, and it's funny too, because like you've seen like some benefits for him in like the media landscape, where I know a lot of people have been like, oh, he's like, this could be like the future of the Democratic Party appealing to the working class. And it's like, he's not working class. He has the like quote unquote aesthetics of the working class, kind of. But there's like, I mean, that's kind of like a broad theme of like, politicians sort of, mispresenting themselves and whatnot to like appeal to folks. And it's like, why, like the fact that like, you're having like media anchors like just blatantly fall for it is kind of hysterical, right? Like people who should be a little bit more educated, a little bit more in the know, that are just like completely fucking clueless.
I mean, this is once again faking it well after you've made it, right? Where it's like, what is working class at this point? And there's like a whole thing. Again, I'm a fan of Carhartt, ironically, somewhat as like a fashion brand, right? But this is like a repeated joke of like, when you need to make the pitch to blue collar workers or when you need to go to a rural area, everyone puts on like that duck jacket, to kind of appeal. And like for like and blue collar politicians at this come a rural or backwoods area, it's like doughy faced, ungroomed quality. And I'm not saying that as like it's all surface level, but like this is just ties into it. If Trump can play business magnate, Fetterman is equally able to play like dough-faced blue-collar guy, and the media just eats it the fuck up. I don't get it. I don't fucking get it.
Yeah.
Oh my god. And then again, just to bring back that point of like Bernie going into media territory, or like enemy media territory, right? On the subject of Gavin Newsom's podcast, like I think we talked about this briefly. I don't have the heart to look at any of that. I don't think there's been any substantial controversy outside of him getting those people on, but like there didn't seem to be any explicit pushback on those podcasts. When we just remember one recently, Newsom had some choice words for Trump after the recent wildfires, right?
Yeah.
It seemed very obvious that it's like this guy has no reason to like any of these guys. And then to top it off, not too long ago, you had Newsom piecing up one Ron DeSantis in a CNN debate, right? So
Fox debate. It was on Hannity.
it was on Hannity. My bad. I can't tell the difference between the two anymore, to be honest
Fair.
with you. I mean, I don't know. We could probably come up with a concept in the future for like online debate culture and political polarization and how that's bled into everything. But how do you go from that to... So Charlie Kirk, what motivates you to get out of bed every morning? I don't know if he asked that. That just sounds like something that happened.
Well, I mean, there was one. I mean, I haven't watched much of it, but I saw like a clip where it's like, oh, like my son's a big fan and whatnot. Which, and again, like it's like, all right, like say what you want about Newsom's politics. The one thing that I thought was like pretty much an undisputed fact about him was that he's just like nakedly ambitious. Right, just like he wants to be president someday. He wants to be, you know, and how does this get him to that stage? I can't see how it does. I just can't. Like it's like okay, you have, you know, all these things where it's like, you know, okay, you have you're not going to get out of a Democratic primary, when you're, you know, sucking off these Republicans. And I don't even think like even if you somehow got through that primary, right? Like Democratic primary voters are built a little different. Well, they'll vote for who they think will win. I just don't see them like having the enthusiasm for someone like, oh yeah, he's gonna win because he's exactly like the other side, just slightly more aesthetically pleasing, right? And it's weird too, where you know after the Trump was elected, there was a lot of push for like Newsom as this guy who was like mean to Republicans. Like essentially that was the push, right? It was like he was mean to Republicans. Look at what he did to Ron DeSantis. Like this is what we need, right? This is sort of like the left-ish version of Trump. It was the argument. People were calling him the woker, which I mean, frankly, if this is an effort to remove that branding from himself, maybe I can understand because I can't think of a more cringe name than the woker. But it's just still just weird to me where it's like, okay, like the whole appeal that this guy had to the electorate was like, this is someone who can make the people that you hate feel like the politicians you hate make you feel.
Yeah.
Right. Like, you know, we can debate whether that's a sound political strategy or not. Personally, I'm a pretty vindictive guy. I can see the appeal, but I don't see the appeal in anything that he is doing subsequently to that.
Yes, and you even see that to like the reemergence of Andrew Cuomo, right? Of this like guy who's willing to just openly do brinksmanship with Republicans, even if he's working with them behind the scenes, right? So you would assume, and if you thought that Trump 1 would be the template for how things go over again, there kind of was this return of a push very briefly for like Democrats who are open to brinksmanship with the right. And I think just as quickly we've fallen back on that. No, Democrats have to protect civility, but there's a strong difference between civility and what they're doing now.
Yeah, and I think there is a divide in the party, and I'll get into Tim Walz in a little bit on this. But I was thinking of Cuomo too, like, all right, so this had come up, and not to be like, you know, hey, like, you know, Japanese soldier found still fighting World War II, but from Christian Gillibrand, who like kind of infamously is known for, you know, getting Al Franken kicked out of Congress, right? When asked if Andrew Cuomo should stick around or should be, you know, allowed to like run for office and whatnot, I almost want to find the exact quote for it if I can find it in a minute. She was like okay with it though. It was, it's like I get that it's like, again, like it's a meme that like, oh yeah, like, all these people who hate her for all this stuff, but like, yeah, so it's up to New York voters, it's not up to me. He has a lot of talent as an executive. He's been a very strong governor, but he's admitted and has said that he's made mistakes, serious mistakes. So like, like, okay, yeah, like she's kind of deflecting here, but like, I mean, that second line is an endorsement implicitly, right?
Well, I mean,
Or like, at least like, hey, he's an acceptable option at the very least.
I mean, I think we're pretty consistent in our position here on the show, right? Where it's like sexual assault is an easy, like, fuck you, you're out. But I think that does speak to, and not to bring up Cuomo as a new line item, right? But the kind of pull he has over New York politicians to kiss the ring. That is problematic. Yeah. But
which is insane that he still has that power. Absolutely insane. And even then, I would say like the response from the Democrats on Eric Adams has been pretty weak too.
Yeah.
And it's just like it's insane that they don't see how like that is like problematic for their brand as a whole, or they just don't care, right? I don't know, but on a slightly, I guess, more positive-ish note, like with the bricksmanship stuff, this came out from I think Tim Walz had explicitly said this, but we've seen him kind of prop up. He's kind of interested in probably running, in the primary for president and whatnot. But we've seen him pop up a little bit more. And during the primary, during the general election, right? Walz, he was the one who did the weird thing, right? That he called Republicans weird, and it seemed to be really effective.
Yeah.
And it recently came out that like Harris aides had told him to like stop doing it. That like it was basically mean-spirited. It's not what the campaign wants to be about.
With the advice they got from Keir Starmer, no less, I imagine.
Probably. And it's just kind of crazy that like, because I was even thinking like he was the one who I think coined like the whole like the politics of joy as like representing the campaign too, which I mean maybe that's a little cringier, but that even seemed semi-effective, right? Like at like being something of a rallying source. But like it's just weird where we have all this like focus on optics, and yet like here's someone who actually seems to at least get like kind of what voters want, right? I mean, I think people were excited to just acknowledge that like, yeah, Republicans are really weird. It's weird that like we need to like police the genitals of people before they step into a room and all this stuff. And then like we're not allowed to do that because even before the election, when we're running to save democracy, we can't be mean to these people, folks. We've got to be nice.
Which was like the 5 minutes of goodwill that the Harris campaign had. I know we talked at length about Biden's team having polling that Harris was cooked from the jump, but they at least had some degree of sincere goodwill. They had some degree of maybe not necessarily a return to normalcy, but just like, hey, we can make a very half-hearted generalist appeal to like the whisper of progressivism and like not necessarily depoliticized or depolarized politics, but the kind of calm, measured return to 2016 that Biden promised. And just blew that away. I don't know what the exact breaking point was. You could argue there were several, but like from Walz's perspective, right? Him at the vice presidential debate, looking like there's a gun pointed at him, and just immediately, like the Manchurian candidate raising his hand and saying, we have to unconditionally give aid to Israel. That lost them a lot of fucking goodwill. I don't think you can...
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was just an issue that like continuously lost them goodwill. And I mean, cynically, I don't know... I don't necessarily know that like how like easily they could have won the uncommitted vote, to be honest. But it's it was like one of those issues they could try to have contrasted themselves with, right? And I mean, maybe they were kind of screwed from the start, but again, the Biden campaign, they also had polling that showed that like how cooked he was, right?
Right,
And
right.
I think the fact that you see like, the minute he drops out of the race that like, you know, Harris skyrockets in the poll the minute the nominations changed says a lot.
Makes
And
a
then it
lot of
feels
fucking
like,
money on that first night too. Like, let's be honest.
right. Like all the momentum in the world for like a short bit, and then like, and I think part of it too is like, I've talked before kind of how classically campaigns like normally like post primary you get sort of that pivot to like the median voter and whatnot, in order to broaden your appeal. And I think that like there was that, but I think there was just so much whiplash because like she didn't have a primary, right? So it wasn't like, you didn't have like, oh, okay, we'll do these things, but then we're gonna like sort of moderate our messaging around those things for the general. It was like, no, there just wasn't time to really get to know what the objectives were, how they were different from Biden, sort of misunderstanding like how anti-incumbent the country was. And I think like again, like in terms of diagnosing that race, it's just wild to me that there's sort of like, like that any calculation you could make of how to win elections going forward, because like Trump won the popular vote. It's like, how can we like make someone who's like the opposite of Trump, right? Like Trump is known for being mean to people. Can we win by just being super nice to our enemies? Super nice to people who call us the opposition, as in like, which yeah, like academics use that term, but like sitting politicians shouldn't be calling each other the opposition. It has, it conjures imagery of a less polite time in politics, that are normally we're quite adverse to, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to that, because like we've talked a lot about like the cruelty of the Trump brand. I don't think like there is a place for like a warmth in politics, or there's a place for a kindness
Sure.
or like a mercy in politics, but it's never to the opposition systemically. It's
Yeah.
to the people who have to do exactly.
And it's like, it feels more like we're concerned about like the warmth that we're giving to um to Republicans rather than to like, hey, the people that are being like their lives being turned upside down and ruined by them.
It's this weird aspirational fetish of like, well, if I was a member of Congress, I sure would be a hoot to work with. It's like, and again, I'm not someone who's like you should be against being cordial in any environment, but it's like,
Sure.
I don't think people care if you shook hands with the Republicans and you had a photo op with them. They care far more about like, did you get funding for roads and libraries in their community? Did you take a photo of like a community org with a big check that you gave them,
Right.
Do you show up to community events for issues that people care about? Like, that's the kind of stuff that matters, right? And we're just seeing a mass abandonment of that on either side.
Yeah.
And just on the subject of cruelty, before I ask my final question of the night, because we're almost hitting 2 hours, I mean, to kind of see the end stage. I mean, I don't even know if there's an end stage or if this is just going to continue to get worse. But like the promised crackdown on pro-Palestine protesters, to have someone's green card revoked just for exercising their freedom of speech rights.
Well, and the proposed approach to it, like especially on college campuses, I think is especially like toxic, right? Where it's not just
Yeah,
like, yeah, there's a personal risk to you for protesting for this, but you've put the entire university environment at risk, where the university now is pressured, whether because it could lose funding and that will hurt, educational opportunities for other people and whatnot. The university is pressured to be the ones to crack down on you, as opposed to, the administration or, the other folks who would normally be giddy to do this, right? It's done in such a way to really turn people against each other as much as possible.
right. And it's like at the risk of just coming off as people can take this how they will. People know where I really stand, right? Is like for Israeli politicians to have this much of an outsized influence on either party to the point that it drives domestic political discourse. It's insane for either party not to take a stand. And this has nothing to do with being anti-Semitic, mind you. This has everything to do with political patronage and who has a say in how American politics are directed. It has nothing to do with national background or ethnicity. It has everything to do with base corruption in our political system, right? It has nothing to do with anything else.
And I think the part about it that's always extraordinary is that the American discourse on Israel, like the Overton window of that, is like smaller than it is in Israel itself.
Yeah,
in a lot of ways, right? Like we don't have a diversity of their perspective really represented at all. And you know, I mean, like to the extent that there is, you know, like meaningful diversity and whatnot, and you know, it's fascinating too because I remember, you know, October 7th where you had all of the like democracy protests in Israel. Right, we're like over like all these like overreaches, the judicial reform, and everything that was happening with Netanyahu, and like during that, you got barely a peep from Americans about it, right? Like within like the American political sphere, right? You know, Joe Biden had said a few things about it, but like you know the people who are you know up in arms, right? The people who like when you see like I think it was Rick Scott who I saw where like there was like an interview he had in his office and you can see like right behind him prominently the Israeli flag. There's not an American flag in sight. And like it's just I mean divorcing like how you might feel about Israel itself, like that's just weird. It'd be weird if it was any other country's flag.
100%.
Like maybe if he was if he was an immigrant from that country, there would probably be a huge scandal about them having a flag from where they came from, right? Like
yeah. I mean, it just goes to show, and again, not to bring Zelensky back up, like there is a clear hierarchy of which client states are favored. Israel has been the favored client state for a long time now, and Ukraine thought. I mean, again, I hate that to bring up like these old jokes from like a time I used to be online, but like, do you remember like after like October 6th, there were these memes of like. I know Zelensky is blowing up Biden's line, wondering where the checks went. Granted, as a joke, but it's like, again, it's like.
I mean, some of that kind of goes like all the way back to what we started this episode, right? We're just sort of like it's like the pea-brained level of attention span in our political discourse, right? From the media, from the public, from the politicians too.
Right, it's one that's like. Again, I think it goes back to just so many missed opportunities during the Biden administration. I don't think you have to adopt a particularly hard stance on Israel to disagree with their policy, to disagree on the outsized influence that has been played upon American politics at this point. If we're at the point where like the Bill of Rights is under fucking question, and you can argue, oh well, these were immigrants, these weren't citizens. Doesn't matter. I thought we prided on ourselves on freedom of speech. The anti-Arabism that has plagued the current discourse, right? On oh well, if you love Palestinians so much, then what would happen to your free speech rights and all those weird, like, anti-Arab... That's actually its own variety of anti-Semitism, mind you. Those canards, right? Like, where are we now? Where are we with this? That we're suspending people's freedom of speech in this country. We've thoroughly cooked up the plot. And I can't even say that I'm in favor of an accelerationist view of Trump that's like, yeah, he's destroying this shit. Because I don't think what's coming at the end of this is particularly good.
No. I mean, I don't think that there's like. I mean, to the extent that I find any acceleration arguments particularly persuasive. I don't see this as like the building blocks for something like better at the end. Like it's not, and it's kind of wild too. Like I was thinking when we're talking about this, like not endorsing that like this level of suppression of freedom of speech, but like it is weird when like it's easier to protest like domestic American politics than it is the politics of a foreign country
Right.
within the United States. At least for now. I mean, I'm sure that crackdown's coming too, to be fair, but like,
I mean,
not
the
not
easiest
endorsing
way
it, but
out, because you're right. Like politicians should not, like if they are fundamentally incapable of admitting faults or laying blame squarely at someone's feet who deserves it. Why can't you then like lie your way through an opportunity and be like, yeah, you know what? As someone who supports Israel, fuck Netanyahu.
sure.
You could have avoided 15 crises doing that. I don't know if that would have played out the way I hoped it did, but you get what I'm saying, right? Like, I don't know. So now I finally have a question that was mainly intended for like the editorialist class, but now I'm just flatly accusing myself of this. Is all politics post QAnon just wish casting?
I unpack that a little bit.
I mean, this is something that's kind of come up on some online discourses I've seen. It's something I've seen brought up on some podcasts I follow. I don't know what particular sense that they use wish casting, and the way I'm choosing to interpret this is in the absence of reliable polling, in the absence of traditional methods of political prediction and analysis to predict trends, right? If you take a look at certain ideas that are brought up in not exactly the entire online left, but a popular refrain is, hey, the ideas we're advocating for are popular. To what extent does reality back that up? Or to what extent is this just a kind of understandable and easy to sympathize with desperation?
I guess I'm torn, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think public opinion polling and whatnot has been stable-ish and
Mm-hmm.
reliable-ish, right? I do think though that like I can see where the wish casting comes in though, where it's like I think that like even when we like sort of see like okay, like this is sort of the projected outcome according to like these public opinion polls, it does feel like we've replaced like interpretation of that with just like vibes. Like I think on both sides,
Yes.
right? We've replaced everything where it's like even if like the techniques that actually can get you access to like some sense of what the public might be thinking, I think it just doesn't matter. It's not persuasive to anyone. Or at least it's persuasive to like very few people, right? Like kind of mostly within academia and whatnot, where they keep trying to like say like no, everything is under control, it's all fine. But I think the public, right, we just replace the interpretation of that with like and there's enough statistical margin of error that you have enough wiggle room to kind of wish cast whatever outcome you want. And I think like part of it too is just we're all living in what now feels like totally separate realities from one another when it comes to how we
Yeah.
shape our worldview. That like we can also just sort of predict whatever will come from that matches that worldview.
I really do agree with that. And I think another thing that just kind of sits in the background of this as well is how opaque and undemocratic our structures have become in recent years, right? It's increasingly difficult to determine what goes on in the halls of power. It's increasingly difficult to determine the even like the full sanity and mental awareness of some of our representatives, right? Like the whole Feinstein issue was kind of indicative of that, right?
Yeah, and then there was that one representative who they found literally in a dementia home, like that
Right,
had been missing
right.
for like 4 months. There was, oh God, I can't remember who was it. Sheila Jackson Lee. Yeah, so this story came out recently. So Sheila Jackson Lee died last year in Congress. And she was succeeded by a 70-year-old this year who died who died a week ago. Freshman member of the House
I
at the
mean,
age of 70.
gerontocracy isn't even a meme anymore. It's like it is an increased on like you cannot describe anything without like wrangling with it, right? So you have these elements of gerontocracy, you have increased just like a lack of transparency in governance. You have just, I mean, like we can't even get into like the fuck ass shit with Doge and stuff, right? And you add on like high profile foreign policy issues also play into this, but even other aspects like energy policy, the farm bill, there are several cornerstones of American policy that like are the levers of control for those are completely out of the hands of the public. They're completely unaccountable to any member of the general public. Not that they should always be directly accountable, but like it's completely out of your hands. Your opinion doesn't matter. And I'm not saying that to discourage anybody or say your interest in this doesn't matter. I'm just saying that's the reality of the situation we have to grapple with. So, under those conditions, what's left but vibes and wish casting?
Yeah, and there's kind of a broader debate over public opinion too, over like how much like even like responses, like how much they really mean anything, right? Like, are people informed enough to like have opinions? That gets into like a different kind of cynicism. I mean, some of it I think is meted out in reality, but I think that you're fundamentally right that like it's to an extent like how much does public opinion matter for anything? Right, it matters when it comes to like who's going to win an election, maybe. Right, like we could predict that on some level of certainty, but again, sort of our hopeful optimism sort of makes up for that statistical margin of error. But we to the extent beyond that, right? Like, okay, like Trump won the election, was it because he was going to implement tariffs? Like, that doesn't seem to be like that's like the issue that drove people out, right? I mean, that seems to be pretty unpopular, but like it doesn't matter at the end of the day, right? Like we're not, the system as it's in some ways as it was drawn up, as some ways as it's kind of morphed and decayed over time. It doesn't matter when it comes to a lot of those things, just like how that's going to work, right? Public opinion is just, I don't want to say it's totally inconsequential, but like, we've limited the methods for which public opinion has a direct impact on anything that happens.
Yeah. And I don't.
And arguably it probably predates QAnon by quite a bit, to be fair.
Yeah, yeah. And it's to the point that's like I can't even pretend to be entirely pessimistic or like doom about it. I'm kind of just stuck there thinking about like what does this augur? I don't know if that's a new mark of insanity for me, but that's just where my head's at.
It's a new mark of not having having a lot of time on your hands. Let's face it.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think that's about everything I've got. We've been at this for. See, every time we come back from a hiatus, y'all always get a 2-hour special. So
yeah,
you're welcome.
It works out. We make up for lost time.
Exactly. Anything else you want to close out on, or anything you want to plug?
Not right now. No. Just we'll see. I mean, I'm sure we'll be back with something. Either more apocalyptic stuff, or maybe something more fun in the future, we'll leave you hanging and in suspense on that.
I could probably hint that it's probably going to be a lot more editorial style stuff this year. I don't know if reporting on the ban and blitz should be our beat this year. That's just how I'm looking at it at March.
That's fair.
But we'll see. Stay tuned. So this has been another episode of Greenhouse Gaslighting. Thanks for tuning in, dear listeners. We'll catch you on the next one. Take care.